The prairie was a place where silence could stretch for miles, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the groan of the wind through dry grass. For an orphan boy who had no family and no home but the dust beneath his feet, survival meant trusting no one and giving little. Yet one evening, when he stumbled upon a young woman lying wounded near the riverbank, her breath shallow and her face pale, he made a choice that would change everything. He knelt beside her, lifted his small canteen, and offered her water. It was a simple act, a gesture of kindness born from a heart that had known too much loneliness. But in the Old West, even the smallest acts carried consequences as vast as the horizon. Her eyes opened slowly, reflecting both pain and gratitude. She drank, and in that fragile exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a bond forged not in words, but in survival. The boy knew nothing of who she was or where she came from, but he understood instinctively that she carried more than wounds on her skin. There was a story behind her silence, a danger that clung to her like the dust of the plains. Still, he stayed by her side, tending to her as best he could, guided by nothing but instinct and the faint hope that compassion might be enough. Through the long night, he guarded the hut where she lay, feeding the fire with broken branches, listening to every sound beyond the walls. In the shadows, his thoughts circled like coyotes. Who was this woman? Why had she been left for dead? And what storm might follow her presence here? Yet as he watched her breathe, her fragile life tethered to the water he had given, the boy felt something stir within him that he had not known in years, the sense that he was no longer utterly alone. But the Old West had a way of reminding its people that nothing came without cost. With the dawn came more than sunlight, the horizon filled with movement, dark shapes riding against the morning sky. By the time the boy stepped outside, his breath caught in his throat. Surrounding the hut were not 1 or 2 riders, but 50 warriors, their faces painted, their horses restless, their presence silent yet thunderous. The boy's heart pounded as he realized the truth. This young woman was not simply a wounded stranger. She was the reason an army had come. In that instant, the boy understood the weight of his choice. By offering water, by choosing compassion over fear, he had stepped into a story far larger than himself. A story of blood, loyalty, and survival. And as the eyes of 50 warriors fixed upon the hut, he knew that the fragile bond he had forged with the young woman would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. The West had no mercy for the unprepared, but it often turned ordinary acts into legends whispered for generations. The boy stood frozen at the doorway of the hut, his small frame dwarfed by the sight before him. 50 warriors encircled the fragile structure, their horses restless, the dust rising around them like a storm waiting to break. He had seen riders before, passing caravans and wandering drifters, but never this. Never so many eyes fixed with such unyielding intensity. For a heartbeat, he considered running, vanishing into the wild grass where no one could follow. But then he heard the faint breath of the woman inside, fragile and steady, and his fear bound him to the spot. To leave would mean abandoning the one life that had come to depend on him. The leader rode forward, his horse stamping the earth with the impatience of a predator held at bay. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face painted in bold strokes that made him look like both man and spirit. He raised a hand, and the circle of riders stilled, their silence heavier than thunder. His voice, when it came, was deep and deliberate. "Who tends her?" he asked. The boy's throat tightened, but he forced himself to speak. "I do." His words quivered, but they carried enough strength to reach every ear in that circle. For a moment, there was only silence. The warriors exchanged glances, their eyes narrowing, their expressions unreadable. Then, with slow precision, the leader dismounted and stepped closer. His gaze swept over the boy, measuring him not as an enemy, but as a puzzle. "You gave her water?" the leader asked. The boy nodded, his heart pounding. The man studied him for another long moment before answering. "Then you have touched her fate." His tone was not anger, but something deeper, respect mixed with warning. The boy's mind spun with questions. Who was this woman? Why did her presence draw 50 warriors across the plain? And why did offering her water seem to carry such weight? Yet even as doubt churned inside him, he felt a strange calm take root. He had been invisible all his life, an orphan drifting through the harshness of the West with no one to notice his existence. Now, for reasons he could not yet grasp, he stood at the center of something far greater than himself. The leader's eyes shifted toward the hut, his voice dropping into something almost reverent. "She carries more than her wounds," he said. "She carries blood, and with it, the future." The boy felt a chill pass through him, as though the world had suddenly expanded, its meaning stretching beyond the dust at his feet. The woman he had saved was no ordinary stranger. She was a thread in a story woven long before he arrived. And now, by a single act of kindness, he was bound to it. The warriors remained outside the hut through the day, their presence constant, their silence unbroken. The boy moved between tending the woman and stealing glances at the circle beyond the door. Each time he stepped out, he felt the weight of 50 eyes pressing against him, as if measuring not just his actions, but his worth. He tried to busy himself with small tasks, gathering wood, fetching water, but the air was thick with expectation, and his hands trembled with the knowledge that one wrong move could turn silence into storm. Inside, the young woman stirred, her strength returning in fragments. She spoke little, her words barely more than whispers, but when she opened her eyes and saw the boy, something in her expression softened. She knew what he had done for her, how he had chosen compassion when it would have been easier to walk away. "Why did you stay?" she asked once, her voice faint as a breeze. The boy hesitated before answering. "Because no one ever stayed for me." His reply hung in the dim light, a truth heavier than he intended to share. That night, the leader returned to the hut, stepping through the doorway as though crossing into sacred ground. He studied the woman, his face betraying neither joy nor sorrow, only gravity. Then he turned to the boy. "You are young," he said, "but you have done what many grown men would not. You gave without knowing, and now you are tied to her fate. Do you understand what that means?" The boy shook his head, his eyes wide. The leader's lips curved into something between a smile and a warning. "It means you will be remembered." The boy lay awake long after, staring at the broken beams above him. Remembered. The word pulsed in his mind, echoing louder than the crackle of the fire. In a life defined by loneliness, the idea of being remembered was both terrifying and intoxicating. Yet beneath the wonder, fear gnawed at him. What if remembrance came not with honor, but with blood? The warriors outside were patient, but patience had limits. And if the woman's fate was truly as heavy as they suggested, then his choice to give her water had already sealed his own. Still, when dawn broke again, he did not waver. He rose, tended the fire, and offered her more water. She accepted it with a faint smile, her gratitude unspoken but clear. Outside, the circle of warriors remained, their watch unbroken, their silence unyielding. The boy realized then that whatever came next, whether blessing or storm, he would face it. The West had always demanded resilience, but for the first time in his life, he had a reason to endure. By the third day, the boy began to notice a shift. The woman's strength returned slowly, her eyes clearer now, her voice steadier when she spoke. She asked for his name, and though he hesitated at first, and used sharing something so personal, he whispered it to her like a secret. She repeated it softly, as though committing it to memory, and in that moment, he felt seen in a way he had never known. But with her recovery came questions of her own. She asked how long the warriors had been outside, whether they had spoken, whether their leader had entered again. Her tone was calm, but her eyes betrayed a quiet urgency, as if each detail meant more than she could reveal. It wasn't until dusk that the truth began to surface. The leader returned, not alone this time, but with 2 elders whose faces were carved with the lines of age and battle. They entered the hut with reverence, bowing their heads slightly as they looked upon the woman. "Daughter," one of them said, his voice heavy with relief. The boy's breath caught, "daughter." The word carried weight, as though it linked her to something vast, something powerful. He realized then that she was no ordinary wanderer. She was kin to these men, blood to the warriors who circled the hut like a living wall. The woman lowered her eyes, her voice soft but resolute. "I should not have been here," she said, "but the raid left me with no choice. I fled, and I would not have survived without him." She nodded toward the boy, and 50 years of weathered wisdom turned to look at him. Their gazes were not unkind, but they were sharp, piercing through him as though weighing his soul. He wanted to shrink back into the shadows, but the woman's words held him in place. She had named him as her savior, and in doing so, she had bound him to her story. The elders spoke in hushed tones among themselves, their language rich with rhythms the boy could not understand. But when the leader turned back, his words were clear. You gave water to one who carries the blood of our people. That act is not forgotten. You are bound now, not by force, but by honor. What you do next will decide not only her fate, but yours. The boy's heart pounded at the gravity of the words. He had never been given a choice so heavy, never been entrusted with something greater than his own survival. That night, sleep did not come. He sat awake by the fire, watching the woman breathe, listening to the quiet murmur of warriors outside. The weight of her lineage pressed against him like the endless sky above the prairie. She was not just a wounded stranger. She was a daughter, a symbol, perhaps even the future of her people. And somehow, the orphan boy who had been nothing to no one was now woven into that fate. As dawn painted the horizon in streaks of red and gold, the boy stepped outside the hut. The circle of warriors stood as steadfast as before, their silence unbroken, but their eyes followed him now with something different. Not suspicion, but acknowledgement. He was no longer invisible. The boy felt the strangeness of it. How quickly a single act of kindness had thrust him into the heart of a story far larger than himself. The leader approached, his presence commanding even in the still morning air. You are young, he said, but you carry courage. Few would have given water to a stranger, not knowing who she was or what danger followed her. You acted without thought of reward, and that makes your choice greater than you know. His words were neither praise nor comfort. They were a burden handed down, a reminder that courage in the West always carried consequences. The boy asked the question that had haunted him since the warriors arrived. Why do they come for her? Why do they stay? The leader's face hardened, the weight of memory etched into his expression. Because she is blood of a chief, he said, and blood of a fallen mother, the last of a line that our enemies tried to erase. The words cut through the air like a blade. The boy stared at the hut, at the woman within, and realized she was not just kin, she was legacy. Protecting her meant preserving a story her people could not afford to lose. The revelation shook him. He had given water to someone whose life carried the weight of an entire tribe. He had thought himself small, a ghost drifting through the wilderness, but now his choices reverberated through lives far beyond his own. For the first time, he felt both the fragility and the power of his existence. The Old West had taught him that survival was solitary, but here, in the shadow of 50 warriors, he began to see that survival could also be shared, and that sometimes the smallest hand could tip the balance of destiny. Inside the hut, the woman stirred, her voice calling his name with surprising strength. He turned back, stepping into the dim light, where she looked at him with eyes that held both gratitude and sorrow. You could have left me, she whispered, but you didn't. And now, because of you, I am alive to face what comes. Her words, simple and unadorned, struck deeper than any promise. The boy realized then that whatever storm awaited them, he would not walk away. The West demanded courage, and for the first time, he had found his reason to give it. The days that followed carried an uneasy calm. The warriors remained as a wall around the hut, their silence steady, their eyes always scanning the horizon. The boy could feel the tension in the air, like the heavy stillness before a storm. Inside, the young woman grew stronger. She could stand now, though her steps were unsteady, and she often leaned against the boy for balance. Each time she did, he felt a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride that he had been the one to save her, and fear of what it meant to be bound to someone whose life carried the weight of 50 warriors. It wasn't long before whispers began to stir among the men outside. They spoke of enemies who had already tracked her once and would surely come again. The boy listened from the shadows, his heart quickening as he pieced together fragments of their words. The woman was not just the daughter of a chief. She was the last living heir of a bloodline their enemies had sworn to extinguish. To have her alive was hope, but also danger. And that danger was closing in. That evening, as the fire crackled low, the woman spoke plainly to the boy. "You do not owe me your life," she said. "If danger comes, you can walk away, and no one will blame you." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the sorrow behind the words. She knew what lay ahead, and she did not wish for him to carry the burden of her fight. Yet the boy shook his head fiercely, his voice sharp with conviction he had never felt before. "No one ever stayed for me," he said again, stronger this time. "But I will stay for you." Her eyes softened, and for a long moment, neither spoke. In that silence, the bond between them deepened, not of obligation, but of choice. The boy, who had once believed himself too small to matter, had chosen to stand. And the woman, who had once thought herself abandoned to die, now knew she was not alone. In the cruel emptiness of the prairie, that truth was enough to make even the coldest night feel bearable. But when the dawn came, the first signs of the storm appeared. Distant figures on horseback, faint but unmistakable, rode along the ridge beyond the horizon. The warriors tightened their circle, their spears and bows glinting in the rising sun. The boy's heart pounded as he realized the truth. The enemies had returned, and the fight that had once belonged to others was now his as well. The tension built with every passing hour. The warriors stood ready, their silence more powerful than any war cry. The boy remained near the woman, torn between fear and determination. He was just one child, untrained, untested. What could he possibly offer against men who rode with blades and fire? And yet, as he looked at the woman, her posture straight despite her wounds, her eyes fierce despite her weariness, he understood. His role was not to fight as they fought. His role was to stay, to stand, to remind her she was not alone. The leader entered the hut as the sky turned blood-red with sunset. His voice was steady, though his eyes revealed the gravity of what lay ahead. "They come for her," he said, "and they will not stop until she is gone. But tonight, they will learn what it means to face a people who do not forget." His words carried the weight of both warning and promise. Then his gaze turned to the boy. "You gave her water. That act made you part of this. Do not fear your smallness. Even a drop shapes the river." The boy swallowed hard, the words striking him with unexpected force. He had always thought of himself as nothing, a shadow, a ghost, someone who drifted unnoticed through the edges of life. Yet here was a man of power and respect telling him that his small act had changed the course of fate. He clung to those words like a lifeline, repeating them silently as the night drew closer to the edge of battle. The woman, sensing his fear, reached for his hand. "Do not let the fear consume you," she whispered. "You already did the bravest thing, choosing to stay." Her grip was weak but steady, and her eyes, filled with both gratitude and determination, anchored him more than the presence of 50 warriors ever could. For the first time, he began to believe that courage did not mean being without fear. It meant standing despite it. As the night deepened, the enemy's torches appeared in the distance, scattered like fallen stars across the dark prairie. The warriors shifted into formation, their chants rising low and steady, vibrating through the earth. The boy stood in the doorway of the hut, the woman behind him, and watched the firelights grow closer. His heart pounded, his breath came quick, but he did not step back. He had no weapon, no armor, no training, but he had made his choice. And sometimes, in the vast silence of the Old West, choice alone was enough to shape destiny. The prairie was alive with fire. Torches burned like restless stars, weaving closer with every passing moment. The boy stood stiff at the threshold of the hut, his breath ragged, his chest rising and falling as if the weight of the entire West pressed down upon him. Behind him, the young woman leaned against the wooden beam, her voice calm though her eyes blazed with urgency. "Whatever happens tonight," she said softly, "know this. You have already changed what was meant to be." Her words struck him like an arrow to the heart. He was no longer just an orphan drifting through the dust. He had become part of a story that would be remembered. The warriors tightened their formation, forming a wall of flesh and steel around the hut. The leader raised his spear high into the night, and a low chant spread among the men, growing louder, fiercer, until it shook the boy's bones. It was not a song of fear, but of defiance, an ancient rhythm born of countless battles fought to defend what could not be surrendered. The boy felt the sound seep into him, filling the emptiness that had lived inside him for so long. His small hands trembled, but his heart burned with the fire of 50 voices. The enemy arrived in waves, their riders emerging from the darkness with shouts that split the night. Arrows cut the air, striking the dirt with deadly force, but the warriors did not break. They stood firm, their spears meeting the charge with precision born of loyalty and blood. The boy watched in awe and terror, his body frozen at the sight of men colliding like storms upon the open land. For a moment, fear threatened to consume him. What place did he have among such giants, such legends? And then he heard her voice again, faint but unyielding. "Do not look away," she whispered. "Stand with me." He turned back to her, and for the first time, he understood that his strength was not in fighting with sword or bow. His strength was in presence, in refusing to vanish, in being the witness to a struggle that had nearly erased her and her people. So he stood there, shoulders straight, his eyes wide, his chest rising not with fear alone, but with resolve. He would not run. He would not abandon her. The battle raged on, cries of pain and fury echoing into the vast night. Flames leapt higher as the clash of steel and the thud of arrows filled the air. And yet, through the chaos, the boy felt something shift deep within him. He was no longer the invisible child forgotten by the world. He was part of this moment, part of this fight, part of this living memory. And, as the hut trembled beneath the weight of war, he realized the truth. He had found a place worth standing for, even if it cost him everything. Hours blurred into shadows of fire and steel. The warriors fought with the precision of men defending more than their lives. They defended blood, memory, and the fragile thread of survival carried within the young woman. The boy's ears rang with the clash of battle, but his eyes never left her. She stood weak but unbroken, her presence anchoring him in the storm. At times, she closed her eyes, murmuring words he could not hear, prayers perhaps, or memories of voices long gone. Her stillness was a kind of courage he had never known, and it gave him the strength to keep standing. The enemy pressed harder, their numbers threatening to overwhelm. Torches were hurled at the hut, flames licking at the dry wood. Panic surged through the boy's chest, but before he could move, the warriors formed a barrier, stamping out fire with their bodies and their blades. The leader himself shouted above the din, his voice like thunder, "This ground will not fall." His defiance sparked something in the boy's veins, something fierce, something unshakable. He shouted too, his voice cracking but strong, joining the chorus of resistance. At one desperate moment, an enemy rider broke through the circle, charging straight toward the hut. The boy froze, his breath caught in his throat, until instinct propelled him forward. With no weapon but a piece of firewood clutched in his hands, he swung with all his might, striking the rider's arm and sending the torch crashing to the ground. The man cursed, stumbling, before a warrior's spear ended the charge. The boy's chest heaved, his arms trembling, but for the first time he felt the raw heat of battle in his own bones. He was no longer a bystander. He was a fighter in the only way he knew how. The woman's gaze met his as he stumbled back into the hut, her expression both proud and sorrowful. "You are braver than you know," she whispered. The boy shook his head, tears stinging his eyes, but her words sank deep, taking root like seeds in dry soil. Bravery, he realized, was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And in that moment, he felt himself change, not into a warrior, but into something equally vital, a guardian of memory, a keeper of the story unfolding before him. As the night waned and the first hint of dawn glimmered on the horizon, the battle began to falter. The enemies, battered and bloodied, drew back into the shadows, their cries fading into the vast emptiness of the plains. The warriors stood tall, weary but unbroken, their circle unbroken around the hut. And the boy, exhausted and trembling, remained at the doorway, his body battered by fear, but his spirit forged anew. He had stood. He had chosen to stay. And in the heart of the Old West, that choice was enough to turn a forgotten orphan into part of a legend. When the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, the battlefield lay silent except for the crackle of dying torches and the labored breaths of weary men. The warriors stood like statues, their eyes fixed on the retreating shadows of the enemy, their bodies battered but unbowed. The boy stepped outside the hut, his bare feet sinking into the trampled earth, and for the first time, he saw what had been endured. The ground was scarred, the air heavy with smoke and iron, but the circles still held. They had not broken. The leader approached him, his spear still in hand, his face streaked with both sweat and blood. He studied the boy for a long moment before speaking. "You stood," he said simply. "Not many grown men could have done what you did last night. You stood when it mattered." The boy lowered his gaze, uncertain how to accept the weight of such words. But in his heart, something stirred, a sense of belonging that he had never known. He had been invisible his whole life, and now he had been seen, not as a burden, not as an orphan, but as one who mattered. Inside the hut, the young woman rose with the help of two warriors. She was pale, her body weakened, but her spirit was steady, her eyes glowing with something unbreakable. When she looked at the boy, her lips curved into a faint smile. "You are part of my story now," she said, her voice hoarse but strong, "and I am part of yours." The boy felt the truth of it settle into his bones. For years, he had wandered without anchor, without purpose. Now, in this fragile yet unyielding bond, he had found both. The warriors began to prepare their dead for burial, their chants filling the morning air with sorrow and reverence. The boy watched quietly, feeling the weight of their grief. He understood now that every choice carried ripples, and his choice to give water had rippled into a storm that had claimed lives. Yet even in that sorrow, he saw meaning. Their sacrifice was not in vain. It had protected her, preserved her bloodline, and given him a place within something larger than himself. As the sun climbed higher, the prairie seemed to breathe again, the shadows lifting, the horizon stretching wide and endless. The boy stood tall in the doorway, the woman at his side, and felt a strange peace settle over him. The night had tested him, and though he bore no scars of blade or arrow, he carried within him something just as lasting, the certainty that even the smallest soul could shape the course of fate. In the days that followed, the prairie slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The warriors remained, guarding the hut as the woman's strength returned in steady waves. The boy tended to her still, fetching water, stoking the fire, and listening as she spoke of her people, her lineage, and the hope her survival carried. Each word was a thread, weaving a tapestry of memory that bound him deeper into her story. He no longer felt like an outsider looking in. He felt like a keeper of something sacred. The leader often came to him, not with commands, but with lessons. He spoke of the land, of loyalty, of how even the smallest acts shaped the course of history. "You are not just a boy," he told him one evening as the fire glowed between them. "You are proof that kindness, even when it seems powerless, can stand against the greatest storms." The boy held those words close, understanding now that his life had been transformed not by strength or skill, but by compassion. The young woman, now walking with steady steps, often sat beside him in the evenings, her eyes scanning the horizon as if listening to the whispers of the land. "I should have died," she admitted once, her voice soft, "but you would not let me. And because of that, the story continues." She looked at him, then with a depth that made his chest tighten, a recognition that went beyond gratitude. She saw him not as a child, not as a stranger, but as someone who had chosen to stand when the world told him he could not. Word of the battle spread quickly across the plains. In towns far beyond, whispers carried of the orphan boy who had given water to a dying woman and, in doing so, had stood at the center of a legend. Some said he had faced 50 warriors himself, others that he had struck down men twice his size. The details blurred, but the heart of the story remained. Kindness had sparked courage, and courage had reshaped fate. The boy listened to these stories with quiet wonder, knowing the truth was simpler, yet no less powerful. And so, the prairie kept its silence once more, but it was not the same silence. It was filled with memory, with voices carried on the wind, with the knowledge that even in the harshest land, compassion could ignite a fire no storm could put out. The boy, once nameless and forgotten, now walked with purpose. He was no longer just an orphan of the West. He was a part of its legend. And though the horizon stretched wide with unknown trials, he knew one truth that would never leave him. A single act of kindness could change the course of a life, and perhaps the course of history itself. In the vast silence of the prairie, where lives were often forgotten as quickly as the wind carried them away, the story of the orphan boy and the wounded woman became something greater than survival. It was a reminder that even the smallest hands, guided by nothing but compassion, could alter the course of destiny. A simple gift of water, given by a child who had nothing to spare, grew into a fire strong enough to withstand 50 warriors. What began as an act of kindness became a legacy that could never be erased. The Old West was a land that demanded strength, where legends were usually written in blood and steel. But this story proves that courage wears many faces. Sometimes it is the warrior who raises his spear. Sometimes it is the leader who calls his men to stand unbroken. And sometimes it is a boy with no family and no name, who chooses not to walk away from a stranger. In that choice, the boy discovered that true strength is not found in power alone, but in the courage to give when there is nothing left to give. The woman's survival was more than a victory for her people. It was proof that memory endures when it is protected by love, and that legacy is preserved not by the strongest weapon, but by the simplest act of loyalty. The boy, once invisible to the world, became the witness and the guardian of a story greater than himself. And through him, we are reminded that no act of compassion is ever wasted. It echoes through time, shaping the lives of those who come after. Perhaps that is the lesson to carry long after the story fades. That kindness is never small, that standing for someone else can transform not just their fate, but your own. The boy could not have known the weight of his choice when he offered water, yet in that fragile moment, he changed the course of history. How many moments like that pass by in our own lives, unnoticed, waiting for us to choose courage over fear, compassion over indifference? If this story left you with that question lingering in your heart, then let it live on. Share your thoughts in the comments below, for every voice keeps the memory alive. If you want more stories like this, tales that remind us of the strength buried in unlikely places, make sure to subscribe. And if you believe kindness can still shape the world, leave a like, because even the smallest gesture carries farther than you think, just like a drop of water given on a desperate day in the unforgiving West.